we've let Tommy wait long enough. How many of you guys have heard the name Tommy Scarless over the last couple of years? Raise your hands if you've heard the name Tommy Scarless. A couple of you. No offense, Tommy, we're North Dakotans.
No, there's reasons for that.
Tommy likes to lay under the radar. He's very quiet and humble. Tommy is one of the premier tournament anglers in the history of walleye fishing. Not this year, not last year. In the history of walleye fishing. Think about that. He is qualified for 13 PWC championships, 9 MWC championships, 11 FLW championships, 4 AIM championships. Now, how many of you guys have even known that there has been that many championships? I mean, Tommy's qualified for pretty much every major walleye fishing championship that has been out there. He's won tournaments against the best walleye anglers in the world, many of them in the MWC, the PWT, AIM, Full Throttle, FLW. And speaking of Full Throttle, Tommy has very strong Christian values. He wears them on his sleeve, and you don't see that very often. So thank you very much, Tommy, for that. Not only is he a walleye guy, he's the 2013 Crappie Masters National Champion. So not only will he kick our butts fishing walleyes, he'll go out on lunch break, catch a limit of crappies, and then come back and kick our butts catching walleyes again. He was the Outdoor Life, named the Outdoor Life one of the top 10 anglers in the planet. Think about that. How many guys, you think about all the guys that you know. Tommy was named one of the top 10 anglers in the planet. And he's here. Drove all the way here from Iowa. Mr. April. River rat. A rapper. Hopefully we don't hear any rapper skills, I'm just saying, but hopefully you don't hear that. So let's bring up Tommy, the poker player, Scarless.
Well, I better pull off a seminar after he said all that, right? What do you think? We're going to do this, I think, we're going to have 2 seminars. And I'm going to ask you a question. I was going to do walleye first and crappie second. You guys have any objection to that? Or would you rather have it the other way around? Okay, so we'll just do the walleye one first. And, first of all, I want to thank Ranger Boats for having me here. They're half of the equation. Fargo Moorhead Walleyes Unlimited is the other half. So Troy and our dealer Ray Sport Marine over there, thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate you bringing me out here. Secondly I want to thank the board and all of the volunteers and all the hardworking members of this club and all the people that fish it and support the club. This is something unique due to the fact that this membership is younger than most of the memberships that I've seen across the country. And it's good to see a lot of our people that are my age at 49 and older that have built this country. And it's also nice to see the young kids, boys and girls, in this crowd as well. So that's pretty awesome. Let's get talking about awesome walleye tactics. And in this seminar, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the things, some of the tactics that I've used for river fishing and the reasons. And when you get into it or when we start talking about the reasons, what I mean by that is there's reasons when you get down to the line, the lure, the rod, and the reel, well, a lot of these anglers can be successful. If we take, say, this top cat right here, Tim Hutchinson, who is a guide out of Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and also guides over on Lake Erie. He's an accomplished tackle builder. I fished with Hutch, unpretentious, really works hard. And there are specific things that he uses as far as the line, the lure, the rod, and the reel that makes him successful. My crappie partner, Kyle Steinfeld, 26 years old, would rather go fishing than date the prom queen. Would turn down a date with Britney Spears or one of those girls in order to catch one walleye. And every time I go leave for hunting or fishing season when I was young, I'd come back home, the girl I would be dating would be gone and I'd have to go find a new one. But there's there's a reason that he's as successful as he is at walleye fishing. Or Jeff Lara, we won the Red Wing tournament last year. And then some of the other victories that I'll talk about, 2008 FLW Walleye Tour Championship, and then the 2012 Walleye Walleye tournament that I won actually over on Red Wing, Minnesota. And this one was over on Bismarck, North Dakota. It's not going to be to actually talk about my successes, but more importantly, why I won and how I caught those fish. And I want to convey this and kind of compare this to Phil Mickelson. You get into Phil Mickelson and it's like, Tommy, how are you comparing this to golf? I shot a 4 under the last time I went golfing last year, and a 4 under 100. But in any event, Phil reminds me of what I would like to epitomize as a walleye angler when it comes to the fishing rods and reels that I use. When he goes to drive, he uses a driver. When he putts, he uses a putter. There's a lot of anglers that, you know, may have 2, 3, 4 combos. That's fine. But I feel that there is a specific rod and reel combo for everything that I do in walleye fishing, and I feel that they make a difference. And I'm going to expose a little bit that too. The other reason I like Phil, great family man, stood by his wife Amy through cancer, got a bunch of kids. I've got 2 boys. I've got one 11 and one 9, and trust me, they are all boys. I'm going to be away from town for about 3 or 4 days, and I'm sure when I get back home, the stories will pile up about yanking on the dog's tail, ears, etc., and all that stuff. Spooning and blading, we're going to get right into this as far as some of the hot trends or some of the things that are catching. These right here are called one-eyes, and a lot of you have probably fished with them. It's something that's really starting to get popular. It's been a big part of my arsenal when I've been fishing with spoons or blades. Even out on Devil's Lake, anywhere where I'm going to fish a jig, anywhere where I'm going to fish a lure, I like to give one-eyes a try. And the reason that I like to give one-eyes a try is that pretty much when you're fishing with a one-eye, it's all offense. There's been a lot of dispute in walleye fishing. A lot of dispute in the tournaments. Should we go artificial only, or should we be able to fish live bait? I like the opportunity to fish both, but I'll be honest with you. More and more, probably 90% of the time, I fish artificial only baits, and this is one of them. Troy Morris, Corey Heiser doing the artificial only walleyes effort. I applaud them for that. I think when everybody else has got the ability to put down a chub that will wiggle and jiggle for them, and those guys are putting down something they've got to make the movement or impart the action on, makes a huge difference. The other thing I've learned about fishing lures, even chunks of lead like this with 2 hooks on it, you don't have to move them sometimes in order to get a strike. An object in the water that's displacing water, that's throwing off sound, that has vibration, flash and attraction, regardless if it's centered or not, attracts fish. And one good story about one-eyes, a couple of years ago I'm fishing the NWT Walleye Tour Championship over on Devil's Lake. And we're fishing where water's flushing through those bridges. A lot of guys fish on the downwind side because it's easier to fish. I like going out into the upwind side, right in the face of the wind. I got less competition. I got more fish usually because that water is channeling through there with current. Throughout this seminar, talking about river walleyes, you'll hear me relate to current more than structure. And the reason that I do that is because current is the structure when it comes to walleye angling. You take a lake guy, or excuse me, let's do this first the other way. You take a river guy and put him on a lake, and he seems to catch fish and figure it out. I've watched guys in the tournaments, guys from around Bismarck, North Dakota, guys from over on Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, or the Green Bay area. Even the Great Lakes, which is one big river flowing through our country. You take a river guy, put him on a lake, he does okay. You take a lake guy though, and you put him on a river and something happens. And Mike Freely brought it up on his radio show today that, you know, river guys or lake guys sometimes, or guys that don't fish rivers, are a little curious about that as far as, you know, the current, or it might be intimidating. Number one is you got to embrace the current. Also, secondly, is what I firmly believe is figure out why those fish are there based on current and not on structure. We've got Lake Pepin over in Minnesota on the Mississippi River, pool number 4. And anglers go over there and we'll watch them fish the same pieces of structure and grind them and pound them to try to catch fish, and they will come up with nothing. And the reason being is that the areas have all the perfect walleye structure, they just don't have the walleye current. When you get onto Lake Oahe, Sakakawea, your reservoirs over here in North Dakota and farther, those fish will still relate to current, regardless of it being wind-driven or it being current-driven. The next time you fish the res, or one of the reservoirs. Think about the fact that from the north comes the current and it flows south. Oftentimes we found that the north sides of points was the only spot on that point that was worth hitting and not the south side. So it's all relative to current. And I'm relating these to current on Devil's Lake. I love fishing them on the Mississippi River. I'm thinking, you know, I'm going to have to try these when I get out there for the NWT Championship. Caught more fish in one day of competition than I'd ever caught in my life. My partner and I, the first day of the tournament, caught 200 and some walleyes in one day. In fact, somebody on short timed me, I think that they said that I caught 11 walleyes in a minute. And I would drop the spoon down to the bottom, tap it on the bottom, lift it up 4 inches, and hold it. And the hold is something I'm doing a lot more in walleye fishing. Just moving around down there and then stopping it and holding it. And then, and get a hit. Reel it up, unhook the fish, throw it back in the water, drop the lure back down, get a hit. And not moving it at all. Getting on the fish's radar, getting it to move. If you look at a one-eye, they've got a hook on both ends. They've got a little blade here. They've got a little fluorescent tubing. They come in a variety of colors. Sometimes I just fish a plain lead one. And in turn is if that lead is shiny, it works good. If it's dull, it sometimes works even better. Color is something that I think a lot of times may exist in your mind. And if it exists in your mind, you better be paying attention to it, because if you're thinking you've got the wrong color on, you probably do, just from a standpoint of mentality. And that's the other thing I'm going to impart and share with you, is that your mental attitude every time you're out fishing is as vitally as important as what you've got tied on the end of the line. If you've got stinking thinking and you think you're not going to catch fish, you're not going to catch fish. I lie to myself. I look at myself in the mirror and say, Tommy, you're the greatest angler that ever lived. And in turn, as I go out and I think, if I just keep moving and grooving, I'm going to find these fish. And oftentimes it makes a big difference. One-eyes, throw them anywhere you want to. Where are we going to use these? What are we going to use? What type of line? Hard line that I use is a good braid, like a 10-2 diameter. I love bright green line. 8-3 fire line. Those are the two lines that I'm probably going to use in this situation. And I found that the bright green line anywhere in the continental United States for walleye, with the exception of Mille Lacs Lake, has never really made a difference as far as fish is with visibility. I tie right directly to the lure. And the knot that I use when I tie super line, regardless if it's to a jig, a crankbait clip, or a spoon like this, is I go through the eye that I'm tying it to twice, pull it tight, make 8 wraps, and go back down through the original knot that I created. The reason I'm going to do that is that if I want to change jigs, I can take my fingernail and strip that knot, pull the line right off the jig without cutting it with the scissors, tie in another lure, put it right back in the water and get to fishing with no tag line. I can tie 4 of those to most people's polymer knot. And with a polymer knot, you got to trim it. If you cut off a jig and it's got a wet polymer knot on it, and you throw that braided wet polymer knotted jig into your box, could rust out the whole entire box and waste all of your jigs. But hard line is good for this situation because, again, it's all offense. If you feel anything, I set the hook. Jigs, spoons, anytime I even sense that something's wrong, we have a terminology called snatching a bite, to where you just sense that something's wrong. And it's no different than shooting deer as far as I'm concerned. If we're driving deer in Iowa and they're come spitting out running 30, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour across the cornfield, if there's lead in the ear, I got a chance. And if I feel that I've got a hook or I've got a bite, set the hook, because that's throwing a bullet at that walleye, and you're going to possibly get a lure into it. The rods that I'm going to use, I like a medium light, extra fast tip on this. If anybody at the end of this seminar wants to come up and take a picture of my screenshots or something like that, I'd be glad to do it. But you know, when we start getting into rods, this was one instance that really made this set into my mind that rods make a difference. I'm fishing with Hutch, the gentleman I showed you earlier, and another fellow, Rick Miller, on the Mississippi River, and we're going through and talking about one-eye rods and fishing. And they've got me down, I think it's like 7-1 each of the anglers. And we're visiting about this, and I'm like, you guys are just better one-eye fishermen than I am. And they started giggling, and they said, you got the wrong rod. We figured we'd get a big enough lead on you before we'd loan you one of ours. I'm fishing with a 7-foot medium fast action rod. I'm like, you're kidding me. And they're like, no. Because the reason being is that with a medium light action rod, when you're setting your hook or you're jerking that one eye, and you can do a variety of cadences with these lures, when you go to snap that rod tip, your stiff rod is making that pop off the bottom bottom immediately, and then as you lift it, it just slowly goes like this. To where with an MLXF or a medium light extra fast action rod, you snap the rod and the lure comes off slowly, and when the rod tip responds with that action, it snaps at the top of its height. Those lures, if you look back at those Walleyes, they've got the top end, the big heavy end, is the one you tie the line to. So when you snap it up and you let go of it and it flutters, it's going to fall end over itself, and it's going to have more action. 610, I fish a lot longer rods than probably most anglers, but a 610, 6.9 medium light action is going to be a good one. And I fish with incredibly small reels, little 10 series or 20 series, 20 or 25 flugers, ice fishing reels. And the reason that I fish with these smaller reels is that I can take Superline and wind it all the way to the spool. In other words, I'll tie it on there with a loop knot, take the sticker that came on the line spool, stick that to the spool in the line, and then wrap over it, and you won't get that twisting or spinning. So no more do you have to put backer on that kind of stuff. All you've got to do is thread it straight to the reel, and it makes your money go farther because those little spools don't hold a lot. But with a 2 or 3 pound test diameter, you don't need a big spool. It'll still hold more Superline than you'll fish in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. When the outer part of that Superline starts to get a little worn or frayed or discolored, I'll spool it from one reel to another. And the old junky stuff will be on the inside now, and the good fresh stuff will be on the outside, and I'll be able to extend my fishing line on Superlines twice as far. And then those small reels, especially if I'm putting nanofill on them or Spiderware Stealth or a braid like Berkeley braid, I use a lot of it for ice fishing. So I get double duty from those reels in the fall when I quit walleye fishing open water and I go to ice fishing. Boom, I take those little reels. The biggest thing is they're light. So when you're fishing with them, you don't get a lot of fatigue or a lot of weight. And when you're holding on to a really good quality graphite rod and you got that little reel on there, man, it increases the sensitivity 10-fold, 20-fold. Vertical around current seams is where I'm going to fish most of these. Anywhere where you see slack water and fast water in the conjunction of those, a current break coming off of a bridge abutment, any place where that walleye can rest and let food come washing by. It'd be just like if a big old boy like me found the chair closest to the buffet crab legs, and as soon as I seen them crab legs coming out, it's like, get out of the way, bar the door, kitty, because I'm going to go get crab legs before Chad Malloy gets to them. But in any event, anywhere where you've got wing dams, riprap, shoreline, rock, drifting at a 45 degree over points on Oahu, or out on a mud flat on Mille Lacs, where a lot of guys have never put a lure like this, and walleyes have never seen them or got conditioned by it. Anywhere you'd use a jig, we rail on the fish in Erie. And here's what's interesting about lures and fishermen. We spend all this money on our boats and our motors and our lures and our line and our tackle. We sacrifice our vacation, paid or not, and we go fishing, and we're afraid to throw a lure that's worth $2 or $3 into a snag. Truth of the matter is, I like going into snags, because if I lose the lure, I get to go buy another one. And it is a proven fact that I have 100 times more lures than I will ever be able to clip onto the end of my line. I have issues, so I want to lose lures. But if you're going to make an omelet, you got to break a couple of, trust me, I got everybody in this room beat individually, except for maybe Troy. But in any event, that's because he can trade Harley Davidsons in on it. Anywhere where you'd use a jig, anywhere where you'd use a lure, they're great. And you know the cadence on them, jerking them, you could snap them, you can jig them up and down, you can just lift them off the bottom and hold them and shake them. And I try to vary my cadences. Do 4 things, then do 4 things, then do 4 things, and vary those cadences, and the fish are going to tell you what they want. Jigs, jigs, and more jigs. I'm probably going to say, let's talk about jigs, and I got half the audience lost already, and they're saying, you know what, Tommy? I got plenty of jigs, I got jigs covered, I know how to jig fish, I don't want to talk about jigs. Do you have jigs covered? Do you really? Quality jigs with quality hooks has changed the way I'm jig fishing and took my jig fishing to another level, and I grew up doing it. I love doing it. Some people have claimed that I'm okay with the jig. I really feel that most anglers don't have jigs covered, and from a number of standpoints. Why choose a quality jig? I use 3 or 4 different teardrop jig heads in 3/8 ounce with 3 or 4 different hook styles in them. I make a lot of my own jigs out of do-it molds. because I can pick if I want a hook that I can pull out of the wood, if I want a stiff hook that I'm fishing out over open cover and I really, with super line, don't want that hook to fail. Saltwater anglers, bass anglers have to have a very rigid hook, and there's times as walleye anglers we have to. The number one reason I want a quality jig is that deal right there. Next time you go walleye fishing and you catch a walleye you want to eat, take your jig and try to stick the hook back into its mouth. You may get it into the softer rubbery part down here, but when you start talking about the bony zony up here, this bony part right here, it's rock hard and you can barely impregnate a jig hook into it. Wonder why women outfish us most of the time? There's a multitude of reasons, guys. They run the universe. They're always right. But more than anything, when a guy gets a fish on, he fusses with it, he shows off. I get 300-pound guys in the pro-ams that can't put a bend in the rod. And it's a struggle. I'm like, dude, you got to keep a bend in the rod or you're going to lose it. And he'll drop tip. No, I don't want to horse it. I don't want to lose it. What does a girl do when she gets a fish on? I got one. Get the net, dummy. It's 8-1 now. And the reason being is she's got a bow in that. Most of the fish that I catch, walleyes, come off in the net. Women's walleyes come off in the net too, but after they've already reeled them all the way to where the eye or the swivel or the jig hits the rod tip, I don't care. The fish is in the boat. Guys, you want to catch more fish? Fish with ultra sharp hooks and fish more like a woman. And when we get into talking about ultra sharp hooks, one rule of thumb I do a lot of, I take little 2x4 cutoff ends. Whenever we're working construction, I pick up all the really short little teeny pieces that most people would put in the trash. And I take those in the boat with me and I poke my jig hooks into them, or my snelled hooks into them, or any hook into them to pop the rust, the paint, the finish, anything that could make that hook less sharp. And in turn, as I take those little wooden pieces sometimes, take a 4-foot chunk of fire line, put a cheap egg sinker or bell sinker on the bottom of it, and put 10 of them into the water and let the wind blow them up shallow. I love fishing shallow water fish. That's why I run shallow water anchors like power poles, so I can position and fish those shallow fish. Those little 2x4 pieces will float. The ones in deep water will go all the way to the shores. The one that hit the rock hump will stop, and they'll be your little troopers there saying, rock pile right here. And it's a good way to find stuff that most other people don't find or most people don't fish. One thing that I've been fishing a lot lately is a do-it or a hutch jig with a bait keeper. These little wire guys are great, especially for holding on live bait. And if I'm going to tie onto it, I'll smash it down. If I'm going to use it in cold water or cold weather, I'll smash down that bait keeper. Or if I've got a straight wire, I'll leave it straight. When I'm going to fish a tournament and I know that I'm going to use Berkeley Power Bait twitch tails and chartreuse and orange, I'll take 5 heads that are the color I'm using, 5 of those tails, and I'll super glue them right to that. And super glue works great right just like that, so you don't need to worry about wasting a tail. But one little drop of super glue right here, you thread your plastic up or your artificial bait up, and it'll hold there forever. Another thing is, putting a piece of night crawler or sliding up a night crawler onto one of these jigs. I want the wildest, craziest night crawlers I'm going to be fishing, even if it's a half of a crawler. And that's because when you put it on a jig, it'll still keep moving. Now, it's always tough, though, to thread a night crawler perfectly onto a jig so that it's got that aquadynamic, natural look to it, because the crawler's always doing this. So I'll get my jig hook ready, and I'll get the crawler ready, and I'll go, bad crawler, bad crawler, bad crawler, bad. And it'll go, and it'll shrink down like that, and you go, book, and you poke it right into the nose of that crawler, and thread it on there, and you own him. Thread it up onto here, push it with your thumb, do that with a minnow, you got him crazy. You don't want the lazy leech or minnow out of the live bait bucket, you want the one you can't catch. People always say, well, Tommy, why do I want to fish with that one if I can't catch it? How can I fish with it? Well, sooner or later you catch it and you put it on the hook. I use a lot of hutch jig heads. They're sharp, they come in a multitude of colors. And what's crazy about this is we're trying to bring back, I'm trying to talk hutch into bringing back the browns and the blacks. Colors that walleye fishermen don't find too attractive, I found that walleyes love. And a plain lead head or a brown jig or something like that, if you ever get a chance to talk to Hutch, tell Hutch that I sent you, and most importantly, tell him, dude, bring back the brown jig and listen to him just whine. He loves that. Dirty water walleyes. We're going to talk about that now. You hear all the pros talking about fishing with the smallest jig possible, or most of the pros. You know, 1/8 ounce, 16th ounce, 32nd ounce. I use a lot of those jigs for crappie fishing. I also use 1/4 and 3/8 ounce jigs for crappie fishing. I'm learning from fishing with a lot of these crappie pros. You're gonna catch a 2-3 pound crappie with a mouth the size of a pop can bottom, gotta use a big jig. There's more than one reason though to use a big jig. I learned years ago at like the first seminar I went to 30 some years ago, Al Linder, he goes, oh, I like using the 3/4 ounce jig because I gotta move it fast. And that way if I gotta move it fast, I'm covering more water and I'm putting it in front of more fish. So that makes a lot of sense. I like to get on the fish's radar. Years ago we're fishing Mille Lacs Lake, or not Mille Lacs, we're fishing Lake of the Woods. And we're up there and we've got a new prototype lure. The boss has the prototype lure, he's got 2 of them, and he gets to keep both of them. And he's scorching these little saugers and walleyes with him. Well, we start doing some photos, they're filming a TV show, he leaves the hut, he reels up the prototype lure about 4 foot so it doesn't get any trouble, throws in a rod holder, 3 foot, and walks out. And I'm sitting there across the shack all by myself thinking, nobody will know if I fish the new prototype lure. I've been told not to fish it, but boy, I really want to fish that new lure and catch a bunch more fish. And all of a sudden my conscience got to me and I couldn't fish it. But then something happened that made me have to fish it. It started sliding towards the hole, it had a fish on it. It's been sitting there for 8 minutes and the thing's moving across and going to go down in the hole. I gotta save it. I gotta save his rod and reel. So I grab it, set the hook, and it's like a 4-pound walleye, one of the biggest ones of the trip. And he comes in, he goes, what are you doing fishing the prototype lure? I look, dude, it would slide towards the hole, swear to God. And he believed me, thank God. But in any event, we start to think, you're in Lake of the Woods, where an AquaView camera you can see about, what, a half a foot in that murky water up in Lake of the Woods? Anybody ever tried to drop an underwater camera at Lake of the Woods? 4 foot, 3 foot off the bottom, that fish just all of a sudden came up off the bottom and hit a plastic darter style lure with no scent. The only thing that was scented on that lure was the walleye lips that it had caught for the hour previous to that. So I take a jig, thread a minnow on it, drop it down to the bottom, reel it up 3 foot, and throw it in the rod holder and watch my ice unit. And I'm watching it, and these big blobs that have been coming in all day long and then swimming away from our bait, gets about halfway to the lure and goes, and eats it. And the pattern was not moving it. How can that fish see that from 3-4 foot away in murky water? I don't think they're like dolphins that swim through and go, ee, ee, and send out a sound and it comes back. But everywhere in that water, especially with a sonar going down, that hits things and bounces off and it gets on those fish's radar. I think big jigs make a big difference doing this, and that's why I fish as many 3/4, 1 ounce jigs that I can. We're working with some 1.5 ounce jigs where the fish may not throw it. The only problem I found with big jigs is if a fish eats it, they'll get the whole jig in their mouth and you can't get a hook into them. They open their mouth and the jig pops back out again. So a lot of times maybe a stinger hook's necessary. These things right here, Lindy Jumbo Fuzzy Grubs, been discontinued for about 10 years. I got the last ones they had at the factory. If I find these at a bait store here in Fargo this week, I'll pay $1.99 a copy for those. Just due to the fact that it's a big 5/8 ounce aquadynamic jig. And out on Oahe, the old glow green, something about that old glow green on Oahe in the Missouri River that really makes a big difference. Big shapes, big power, 5-inch power baits like this, or say like the Havoc Sick Fish. I love fishing big bass baits, big crazy swim baits. Look at what they're doing right now with the 9 and 11 centimeter Rapalas, and how that's really making a difference. I really didn't want to show this to some of my fellow MWC and NWT competitors in the room, but I've won probably close to $100,000 with this dude right here. You take a lizard head, you pop it off, you thread it up on a jig, and you go vertical jigging. Another thing I like to do is take this and throw this on an 1/8 ounce jig, and throw it up into the rocks in Chamberlain, South Dakota, or up at Sakakawea, or anywhere where you've got wind driven up in the spring. There's something about all that tentacles and all that junk in that dirty water, and if you set it up with some power bait or gulp scent, that even makes it even more deadly. When I go jigging, I use the same line I use when I'm fishing with spoons. Same kind of reels, I still use the little reels, but this is when I go back to my 7-foot medium fast. If I go to a really heavy rod, or a really heavy jig, I'm going to use a heavy bass style rod like the St. Croix 7-1 Legend Bass Tournament MF. It's actually an MHF, but it's labeled as an MF. Don't ever trust what any different rod manufacturer labels the rods at. You got to kind of wiggle them, you got to kind of move them. One rod company will call one of the rods a medium heavy, And the other one they'll call a medium, and the medium will be just as heavy as the medium heavy or vice versa. So that makes a big difference. Again, I like that light reel, that small reel on there. It makes a huge difference as far as the line is concerned. And then when I'm jigging again, I'm going to go back to varying my cadences or varying my strokes. Think about that. When you're vertical jigging, when you're drift jigging, when you're moving a jig, are you one-dimensional? Do you move it? Do you change your cadences? Develop your lineup. Pay attention to what your buddy's doing, but not too close, because it always seems like when I'm trying to match what the guy in the boat's doing to catch fish, I can't catch them the way they can catch them. But if I go back to my lineup and I go back to my cadences, then I can do my thing and catch my fish and do a little bit better. Drifting jigs and rigs. This is something that is so simple, but it helped me. It was the main reason I won the FLW Walleye Tour Championship in 2008 on the Missouri River, and it's one of the reasons that I won the tournament over in Red Wing when I won the FLW there in 2008. Now, I caught a lot of my fish three-way and wing dans, but the fish that gave me the extra added fish I needed to win that event was from drifting jigs and rigs. And when I say drifting, you might have heard of dragging jigs. It seems like they drag a lot of ribworms and rigworms over on the Mississippi River. I'm talking about the same thing, drifting with the current, dragging jigs, but I'm actually trying to go as fast as the current or a little bit faster, or as fast as the wind or a little bit faster. And what I mean by that is about 5/10, 7/10 of a mile an hour, if that's what the current's going, I want to go about a mile an hour. So I'm pulling that downstream a little bit faster. And when it works the best is a cold front when the wind's blowing downstream. That's where a lot of times the fish abandon standard methods and they get tough to catch. I will use this when all else fails. And it's this simple. You take the rod and the jig and you put half a crawler or an artificial shape on it, you pitch it about from here to the wall, and you throw it in the rod holder. And you leave it there until you get a bite. And then you leave it there until the fish is hooked. And I'll explain that here in a second. We'll go over the jigs that I'm going to use. Now at this point I'm going to step down to a 1/16, 3/32. I'm going to use a light jigs. Sometimes 1/16 is too light, sometimes 1/8 ounce is too heavy. Seems like 3/32 baby is always right. So that's the size I like to use. And I'm going to use a lot of times on one rod a bright color and on the other rod a dark color. They seem to want orange and chartreuses, or they seem to want something dark like a black or a brown. I don't experiment with a lot of stuff in between, but I do experiment a lot with artificial baits. Using a power minnow, using say a twitch tail minnow, any type of shape that's long and slender, looks like a little bit, and you know where I learned this? Years ago in Chamberlain, South Dakota, I think it was 2004, Berkeley wanted us to start fishing more with artificials in the walleye realm, and gulp had just come out at that time. So what they did was after the PWT tournament, they sent everybody home, they kept their 10 pro staffers there, and they paired us up with 10 riders, and they said, you're leaving the minnow buckets on shore. And that was something at the time, you take 11 years ago, it was pretty intimidating. What do you mean? We're at Chamberlain, South Dakota in the spring, and we can't fish with minnows? We're going to embarrass ourselves here. And Eric Nag at the time, who now works at Northland Tackle, says, don't worry, Tommy, you'll figure it out. And I get an outdoor rider, and we go out fishing, and I've been vertical jigging. I got 10th place in the tournament. And we get out there, and I'm figuring we're just going to do the same thing I was doing, but instead of putting a minnow on there, we're going to put a power minnow on there. And I said to him, I said, here's the tackle box. Use the orange and chartreuse jigs. So we get fishing, and he goes, after about a half an hour, he goes, Tommy, and I had no idea what he's doing in the back. I've got the bow of the boat into the wind. He's behind me. And I'm not paying any attention to what he's doing. He goes, Tommy, I need more jigs. I'm all out of the orange and chartreuse jigs. I said, well, use the chartreuse or use the orange. Because when I said use the orange and chartreuse, I meant the combo orange and chartreuse. He goes, no, I'm out of the orange and chartreuse, the orange and the chartreuse. In fact, I got into the lime, and I'm almost out of those too. So I'm like, dude, I got to figure out a way to keep half my jigs in the boat. And I give him a bottom bouncer, a 3-foot chunk of line, and a snelled hook. And I thread a power bait minnow halfway up onto the line past the hook. The hook is about in the middle of the bait, and it's bent. And I'm figuring I'm just going to, I'm going to turn him loose on this so that at least we can get through the day with the jigs I got. And I put it in the water and it spins seductively. Slow death was a really well kept secret at the time in 2004, but this is a version of redneck slow death. You don't need one of them fancy hooks. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, I'd eat that. If you look at a bait and it looks sexy in the water, I gotta believe that a walleye is gonna think it's sexy too. So I turn him loose and I get it back up to the front and he goes, I got one. I turn back around, I scoop a perfect slot fish. I go back up to the bow, he goes, I got one. I scoop up another perfect slot fish. I sat there and I watched him now this time. He dropped it in the water, turned the reel handle, closed the bail, and got another one. And I said, man, I better find a bottom bouncer and 3-foot line and put on one of those power minnows. But it made all the difference in the world. And you know, it's just something drifting or dragging downstream. If I'm going to drag a rig or drift a half a crawler or one of those power bait shapes, I'm going to use a little egg sinker, like a 1/16 or an 1/8 ounce or a bullet sinker. This one I like even better than a bullet sinker because it's got a rounded nose on it. It doesn't snag up as much or wedge up as much. And in turn is a really ultra sharp hook. For this I'm going to use probably a number 4 for a plastic shape or number 2 for an artificial shape like power bait. And then if I get smaller, I'm going to go down to a number 6 for a half a crawler and just hook it through the nose. And all you got to do is, again, throw it, that jig or that rig, out about from here to the door, maybe a little bit farther, click the bail throw in the rod holder. And this is the key. You'll be watching that thing drag downstream across the point, across the mud flat. That rod tip will be doing this. Maybe it goes across a clam bed, maybe it goes across sand. But all of a sudden it'll do this. And that's a fish. And the hardest thing in the world is to keep your arms crossed and watch it do this. Because it's not time yet. All of a sudden you'll see it go. And that's where that fish, swimming downstream from it, figured out he finally better do something. He got away from all the rest of the fish, and he's going to suck it the rest of the way in. Or you're going to look over and it's going to go. And that's that fish doing this. I'm hooked. I'm hooked. Time to reel. Now if it does this, keep your arms crossed. It's snagged. It's not snagged. You laugh. Keep your arms crossed, because the guy that grabs the rod and goes, I got a snag, has a snag. The guy that keeps his arms crossed, it might just stretch and roll that head out of that snag and go, pew! And that fish that had been following it go, and he'll eat it when it flies through the air like that. And when it snags up like that, it might have the head of the jig up against a stick. And you want to let it naturally stretch that monofilament and roll over it. And that makes all the difference in the world. The outfits I'm going to use for this, I'm going to definitely use monofilament. And I think the biggest mistake that most anglers have made is they've gotten away from fishing with monofilament line and they started fishing with super line, like fire line. What are you doing? You over here causing trouble? Okay. 8-pound Trilene XL, I've been fishing with it for over 30 years. It's the best line to use. I usually use, in this situation, the moss green. I use the clear for casting crankbaits. When you take this line and tie it onto a jig, or tie it onto the swivel, right by the sinker, oftentimes with a jig what I'll do is I won't wet the line when I tighten it down on my jig. Now it might take that knot from 8-pound test to 5-pound test, but the beautiful thing about it is when you get a snag, you grab the spool, you point the rod straight at the jig, and you let the boat keep drifting you, and finally it breaks, and it breaks right at the jig. You don't lose all your line. It's okay to use trashed monofilament in this situation, because you're going to trash it anyway after dragging around all day long. When I'm going to fish this, I'm going to use a 7.5 or an 8-foot rod. My favorite is the 8-foot Syncroy Icon 2-piece, because I've always got 4 of them in my boat, ready to rock and roll when all else fails. And the 8-footer is longer. You can spread it and get your spread out a little bit different. If I've got my boat turned sideways in the wind, and I've got an 8-footer off the bow and an 8-footer off the back, and my Ranger's 20 foot. Come on now, everybody in here to help out the people from Nebraska. 6 to 8, and 8 is 16, a 20-foot Ranger is 36. I've got a combine going through the water instead of a 2-row picker. Now, if the wind's blowing up current, I point the boat straight down, I put all 4 rods off the back, I run the trolling motor while my guy in the back is fishing the rods. If I was able to prepare and got my Terova instead of my Fortrex in the boat, I could be in the back of the boat running that motor with my handheld unit and get it going downstream. This is where I'm going to step up to a 30 or a 40 series, a bigger reel with large capacity monofilament capabilities, a 30 series fluger. And if I want the rod of all rods for doing this, it's the blue 7.6 Legend Walleye Tournament MLXF, which is a great live bait rigging rod. This is overbuilt and too expensive for just dragging rigs. You want something that's limber and it doesn't have to cost an arm and a leg to do it. That's why I use the icons. Real quick, public service announcement. Invasive species, we don't need them out here in the Dakotas. So if you're going to go fishing, you go from one body of water, you pull your boat out. 3 words: clean, drain, dry. A lot of people say they're coming. Why are we worried about invasive species? If we slow them down, the biologists have an opportunity to figure it out and stop them before they get out of control. The next thing I'm going to talk about is fairy wands and sissy cranks. And kind of a sissified title right there. I came up with the name, but Matt Straw wrote the article. It's in the Walleye Guide right now. Fairy wands and sissy cranks. Why do we call it that? Fairy wands came from the bass guys. When you fish a spinning rod, bass guys make fun of you and say, "Oh, got one of them fairy wands, don't you?" They're not laughing now from a lot of these guys, Mike Iaconelli, or a lot of the Western anglers that are fishing light line, drop shotting. Fairy wands are winning a lot of money on the bass circuit now, and a lot of guys are paying attention. Sissy cranks are little teeny crankbaits. I throw these little number 4 Selma Hornets. Even the number 5 is considered small. Little teeny Berkeley flicker shads out on wing dams on the Mississippi River, and they've never seen them. I love throwing these right here anywhere I go, because at $8 a copy, most other guys aren't going to cast this into snags and northerns at Devil's Lake. Hey man, if it means I'm going to catch the trophy of a lifetime, win a tournament, or get dinner, and those are by far the best eating fish on the planet, I'll use an expensive crank. If you're afraid of that, then you go to one of these. But the one thing I found about like a hornet or a shad wrap is they don't rattle. And if you want to attract Mr. Snot Rocket out on Devil's Lake, put a rattling bait in the water, and that's the northern lure to have on. One thing I'll do on northerns on Devil's Lake is if the northerns move in while I'm catching walleyes, I leave, I let them get disinterested, I come back an hour later and the walleyes have gone. Mr. Snot Rocket left. It's time for us to come back up shallow, boys. Rattling baits, they'll seem to attract northerns and make a big difference. Same rod I'm going to use vertical jig in the St. Croix Avid X, which is a new rod out by St. Croix right now. Awesome quality and sensitivity for $200. It's actually the best value rod that St. Croix's made in a long time. And I also use that same one I use jig in the Legend Extreme MF. I'll use a 30 or 40 series reel, big capacity. This is where I want fresh monofilament though. And I like using the clear, because then I know if I've got the clear on one of those rods, it's brand new. When I'm done using it for casting crankbaits, I use that spool of line for dragging jigs, because even if the line's trashed, or the memory is in it, or it's stretched out, it's still a good line, because you go through a lot of line when you're dragging jigs. And in turn is what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to cast these crankbaits anywhere I can cast them. I love throwing into wood, and the deeper diving crankbaits work better in wood, sticks, trees, shoreline cover, because they tilt. You throw in an original Rapala or a flatter countdown, and the hooks are all on the bottom and they're dredging through and they're snagging up a lot more. But a deep diving crankbait, especially one that floats, will work up and over those sticks when you're casting it. And I'll throw it out there and I'll burn it back the first time, throw it out the second time, twitch it back, throw it out the third time, slow roll it. When I'm taking it through timber, that's when I really slow it down, because it'll hit that wood, I'll stop it, it'll float up and over, and I still use monofilament. I have lost more fish with super lines and casting crankbaits and lost more money because it doesn't stretch. Where the monofilament will stretch, and although you're going to lose 1 or 2 more lures to a northern with a monofilament, if you've got a problem with that, or you've got a problem with the fact that it's just not as abrasion resistant, it's okay to throw a chunk, about 2 or 3 foot chunk of big fluorocarbon, like 20-pound fluorocarbon, onto the front of that crankbait, or use like 20-pound fire line, and that'll work as a good, inexpensive leader material when you're doing this. The best learning example I've ever had with casting crankbaits, I'm going to go back to the do-nothing approach of killing a bait and just letting it sit there, is I'm fishing down in Arkansas at Bull Shoals in an FLW, or a PWT one year. I can't remember, we've had a couple of them down there. It was a PWT because I remember Mark Martin and I talking about this tactic. I'm casting up to shore and I'm reeling the lure back and I get about halfway to the boat and I just taken off my rain suit. I'm not catching fish. My fish that were in this area, thick and hot and heavy the day before, are gone. And I know I didn't swordmouth them all because I only caught a couple in 2 casts. And I start getting frustrated. Again, I got the bait halfway back to the boat. I got a rattling suspending shad wrap on. And I'm doing a redneck boat clean. I'm kicking all the rain suits and all the rods out. And all of a sudden, I get a bite. I set the hook and it's a 4-pound walleye. Get that joker in the box, go back to casting to shore. What was I doing? You know, I always try to think, man, and I'm the biggest airhead you've ever met when it comes to remembering certain things. Other things I can remember every detail like it's yesterday. But when I'm vertical jigging, I always have trouble remembering what I was doing to catch that fish. And that's where I told you about earlier about going back into your cadences and going back into your repertoire, because it just comes naturally for me. So I can't remember, I'll just go through my cadences, I'll look at the eagles, ooh, look, a butterfly, oh, get a bite. In this instance, I remembered I'd cast it to shore, reeled it halfway down, and started doing this. So I cast the bait back up to shore, reel it halfway back to the boat, and I start doing this. And I watch the rod tip, and the rod tip's just kind of doing this a little bit. I get another bite, catch another fish, getting closer to winning another tournament. I'm thinking to myself, okay, the rest of the day, cast ashore, reel it halfway back, and just sit there and twitch a little bit, get a water. I'd kill that bait for 2 minutes and get a bite. That bait just sitting suspended in the water. So killing a bait for walleyes and changing cadences sometimes is all it takes. Again, XL Clear 8-pound test. In really snaggy stuff, I might step up to 16-pound test, but that's what I'm going to use when I'm casting crankbaits. And again, throw them everywhere. Try to lose those baits and you'll catch more walleyes. Walleye flies. Hottest thing I've got going right now as far as my river repertoire, while everybody else is vertical jigging, and I love to vertical jig, I'll switch to a fly and I'll drag back upstream while they're drifting downstream, give the fish something different to look at, and I'll catch fish. Now when I'm talking about flies, I want you all thinking, man, where could I use those? You think about freshwater shrimp out on Devil's Lake. What happens if we drop shotted one of those and tried to catch a perch through the ice? It looks just like a freshwater shrimp. Where else can I use flies? Where else are there mayfly hatch? Tie one of these on a 2-lure state. Now you get over Minnesota, you've got a little trouble because you can only fish with 1 lure. But if I'm over here in North Dakota, tie 6 inches, 8 inches of 20-pound test line onto the back of your crankbait and put a fly back there. So you got this big bait going through the water, and you got the little trailer going through the water like that. I like using them on 3-ways. I'll tie a 3-way swivel, go 4 foot back to a fly, 2 foot back to the second fly, so I'll have 2 of them in tandem doing this. And then I'll use an 18-inch dropper to a pencil sinker. And when I pour my pencil sinkers, we used to pour them where we'd only put 1 eye on them. Now we put an eye on both ends, because if the little pencil sinker's too heavy, I'll cut a chunk of it off and I'll still have that little sinker that I can use later on. Or if I cut it in half, I got 2 sinkers. The way that I'm going to fish a fly is I'm moving through the water with that double rig. I go and jerk it forward about 1.5 feet. The backstroke stops where the sinker hits. So you snap it like this, or you can just flap along like a big slow bird, like a cormorant flying through the, well, not a cormorant, like an eagle. Or you can go like this. You can do just about anything you want to until you figure out what the fish want. In this situation, I'm going to use a 7-foot medium fast or a medium heavy fast rod. It doesn't have to be a real expensive rod, but a good graphite rod. You're going to feel it. You're using Superline, so that makes all the difference in the world. 20-pound braid works really good. 20-pound, say, Fireline works really good. And then a low-profile Abu Garcia Silver Max reel. And the reason I'm specifying a certain reel here makes all the difference in the world. It's got a flipping feature on it. Whenever I'm fishing bottom bouncers out on the reservoirs out west, I like that flipping feature, because if it gets deeper, all I got to do is hit the thumb bar and I can let out a little bit more line. If it gets shallower, I've learned to reel on the side of my leg with that bait caster, so I can fish 2 rods and fish around without having to sit on one or worry about it going over the side of the boat. The flipping feature was built for the bass guys. Now the only guys that are using it pretty much are walleye guys, and it makes a big deal. Last thing I'm going to talk about in walleyes is fishing the trees. And I'm going to say this over and over again, you don't need to fish spinner baits to catch those fish out on the reservoirs. And this is one of my favorite tactics to use, and it's one of my biggest secrets. In this situation, when I'm fishing the trees, I'm going to fish again a 7-foot Legend Elite medium fast or medium heavy fast. That's my handheld rod, or I'm going to use this Avid X in medium heavy fast. And then I'm going to use a low profile reel. Now I'm going to do a twofold approach when I'm approaching the trees. You find a big tree flat. The best flats are the willows. They grew up for about 4 or 5 or 6 years. The ice froze them in, broke the tops of them off all at one level, and then the water came up. And we had those years out on Oahe where that happened in several places. And you had a literal landing strip of treetops that those fish would sit in, and when a lure got drug over them, a lot of guys, you know, were pulling spinner baits through them. They were doing that at 1.5 to 2.5 miles per hour. The slower you go, the farther you can pull fish out of stuff. Same thing with ice fishing. The farther you can get that fish up to come, the more committed he's going to be and the more strikes you're going to hook up with. So with this, I'm going to fish one set of rods by jerking baits across the top of the trees. The lures I'm going to use when I'm doing this are going to be the standard Husky jerks, 10 or 12s. I might even step up to a 14. Or if you really want to get crazy, you can use like the pointers, the Lucky Crafts that cost about 20 bucks. The way I found this out, we were going out to Hawaii to fish a tournament, and I've got a ton of these in the boat, and I know these catch fish. But I had just gotten to bargain bin at Gander Mountain, and they had those big X-Wraps or something. They were whatever they were in those big blue packages. They were about this big, about 15 to 18 centimeters, and they were heavy, and they were like 4 bucks in the bargain bin, normally $18. And I'm thinking, honey, they were on sale. And it turned as I pegged the whole bin. I got a shopping cart. This kid from Gander Mountain comes up and says, "You must have really done good fishing with those once before." And I said, "It's the first time I've ever seen them in my life, but they're 4 bucks, not buying them." Get out there on the top of the trees, and I got planer boards out, and I'm going really slow, and I'm jerking these across the top of the trees. And I didn't have it out there for like 28 seconds. And I reel it in, and it's a nice slot fish, like a 19.5 incher. Cast it back out again, go a little bit farther. It's a 27 incher. I'm thinking, man, I hope this isn't a fluke. I throw back out there again. I call my buddy Ross Grothy that I travel with. I go, "Ross, I think I'm onto something." He goes, "What are you doing?" I says, "Well, I'm casting these jerk baits out behind the boat about 60, 70, 80 feet. And then I'm letting about another 20-foot line out, and I'm jerking them along. I got to go, Ross. I got number 3. So that's half the program. The other half of the program is to use 10-pound Trilene XT. More and more I'm going back. They brought back out solar. So all my trolling rods and crappies for sure have this bright green solar line on, so when it goes to the planer boards I can manage it. I don't get them crisscrossed up as much. I can see where the line's going. Use a great big OR12 offshore planer board, and you use a 6500 LC line counter. So when you've got those out there, you've got one board on each side of the boat, and then you and your buddy that's fishing the boat got 2 jerkbait rods. Bad news to take a third person fishing, as far as I'm concerned, most of the time, unless it's a kid, because it's hard to fish 3 jerkbaits out the back of the boat. You're always tangling up with each other. That's an instance where if I was to take my sons, I'd go like this while they went and jerked the rods along. It's all about them when you take them fishing. The planer board rods, you don't have the shallow diving baits on it. When I figured this out, I was over probably 11 to 12 foot of water on top of those trees. So I was taking Husky jerks. Back then they didn't have the frenzy flicker minnows. Those weren't out yet. But any bait that I could run right on top of the trees. Now remember it like it was yesterday. When we started practice, we needed 21 to 22 foot of line out. As the water dropped a little bit in the reservoir, we needed 18. Because they keep snagging up. You wanted those lures right at the treetop level, a little bit above, and you'd go 1.2 to 1.4 miles per hour. Really slow for what we think trolling speed should be. But as those boards were out there, and you'd be traveling along watching your mapping, as soon as you'd lose the trees, you'd turn to get back on them, and the board you killed with those suspending baits would get bit. And I'm going to use anything like a deep diving bait, like these flicker minnows. Big number 9 flicker shads are great. They have both shad and smelt and perch, so both profiles work good. And again, a big Selmo lure, number 6. I throw a lot of number 6 Selmos at wing dams. They make a big deal there too. Catch a lot of fish. The key to it is mapping. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to establish where these flats are at, where these trees are going to grow up. So if we look at our map here, and we come down, wherever you've got a break off of that river hitting the shore and then coming out across over to this side, here's a flat right here. So if I start looking at this, there's a really nice flat right there. There's a flat there. There's a flat there. There's a flat there. There's a flat there. And I have my electronics set up so I can mark both fish and trees at 20 to 25 miles per hour. So as I'm cruising along, I don't stop the boat unless I mark trees. Then I turn around, and instead of trying to mark fish at a slower speed, I've already gone over part of those trees. I go right back upwind and try to take those trees downwind. Because when you're going with the wind really slow, it pushes you along. If you're going into the wind and you get a fish on or you snag up, it's always tougher to control the boat, and it will swing you back over your lures. So when I'm doing this presentation, I try to go with the wind, with the exception of if I'm on the reservoir. With the wind sometimes is against the current. And it always seems like those fish want it going down current or up current. So pay attention. Are you going up current, upstream, or are you going downstream? And there'll be times where we'll go into 3-foot waves to duplicate the pattern. The other thing about going into the current versus going down the current, when you're going into the current, it'll lift your lures up a little bit by the drag on the line. When you're going with the current, it'll push your lines down a little bit deeper. So one direction, you're going to be at the perfect height, not snagging the trees. Going with the current will push those lures down into the trees, and you'll snag up a lot more. And those are all the things to be considered when you're fishing like that. So I'm going to take a little break right now. If you guys want to find out where that hutch tackle is at, you can go to riverwalleyes.com. I also write a Scout, North American Fishing Scout blog, and you can find me on Facebook. And here after about a 5-10 minute break, then you can find me. If anybody's got to take a bathroom break, I'll get the crappie seminar ready, and you'll find me up here doing crappies. Thank you.